I was 9 when I first realized that my last name was a problem. It was during roll call on the first day of school. The teacher paused when she got to my name. Her brow furrowed as she tried to sound it out. It wasn't hard. It wasn't any more complicated than Anderson or McCarthy, but she butchered it anyway. She sighed and looked up at me. "Do you have a nickname?" I shook my head. "No, Mum." She smiled, but it wasn't warm. Well, I might just have to call you something simpler." The class laughed. My face burned. That was the first time I understood that some names carried weight and some names carried burdens. By middle school, I learned that my skin carried burdens too. One afternoon, I was playing at the park with my friends when a group of kids from another neighborhood showed up. They were older, bigger. One of them pointed at me and sneered. "You don't belong here." I didn't understand. "This park isn't for you," another boy said. I looked at my friends. Some of them shrugged, some looked down. None of them spoke. And for the first time, I felt something settle deep in my stomach. A weight, a truth I hadn't wanted to see. By high school, I had learned to navigate around it. I knew which stores I couldn't walk into without getting followed. I knew which neighborhoods I shouldn't ride my bike through after dark. I knew that if I got pulled over, I needed to keep both hands on the wheel, speak politely, and move slowly. I learnt these things the way other kids learned algebra, like a formula that, if followed correctly, would keep me safe. But no formula is perfect. One night, I was walking home from a football game when I saw flashing lights behind me. I stopped, my heart pounding. The officer got out of his car, one hand resting on his holster. "Where you headed?" I swallowed hard. "Home, sir." He looked me up and down. "You sure about that?" I nodded. He stepped closer. "You match the description of someone we're looking for." I knew better than to ask what description. He asked for my ID. I reached for my wallet slowly, carefully, the way my father had taught me. He stared at it for a long time before finally handing it back. "Get home safe," he said, like he was doing me a favor. I walked the rest of the way with my hands clenched into fists, my breath coming too fast. When I got home, my father was waiting at the door. I didn't ask what happened, he just nodded like he already knew. "Some fights," he said. "You don't win by swinging." I didn't answer. I just went inside and sat in the dark, feeling the weight of something I couldn't shake. By the time I got to college, I thought I had outrun it. A new city, a new start. But racism doesn't disappear, it just puts on a different face. My first week, a professor asked if I was on an athletics scholarship. I wasn't. At a party, a girl ran her fingers through my hair without asking, laughing like I was some exotic pet. In a group project, my classmates ignored every suggestion I made, until one of them repeated my idea, and suddenly it was brilliant. I learned that even in spaces where I was supposed to belong, I was still expected to prove myself. Then came the internship. It was a competitive program, but I had the grades, the experience, the recommendations. When I got the offer, I was ecstatic. On my first day, I walked into the office ready to work, but as the weeks went on, I noticed things. The way my supervisor barely looked at me when I spoke. The way my colleagues called me aggressive when I disagreed with them. Even when my white counterparts did the same thing and were called assertive. The way a senior manager introduced me at a networking event and said, "We're really proud to have him here, he's part of our diversity initiative." Diversity initiative. Like I was a charity case, like I hadn't earned my place. I swallowed my anger, smiled and shook hands. But that night I sat in my tiny apartment and stared at my resume, wondering if I would ever be seen as just qualified, instead of a checkbox on someone's quota list. The breaking point came a few months later. I was working late on a project, something I'd poured weeks into, when I found out that my supervisor had given credit for my work to another intern. I confronted him the next morning. He shrugged. "It's about perception," he said. "You don't want to come across as difficult." Difficult. Another word for not fitting in. Another way of saying that I wasn't playing the game the way they wanted me to. I walked out of that office that day and never looked back. I finished my degree, I built my career, I worked harder than anyone around me, but the truth never changed. At networking events, I was still asked if I was part of a mentorship program. At work, my ideas were still questioned until they came out of someone else's mouth. At stores, I was still followed. At restaurants, I was still given the worst tables. At night, I was still careful when I walked too close to someone, making sure they didn't think I was a threat. And one day, I looked in the mirror and saw what all of it had done to me. I had spent my whole life trying to fit into a world that had already decided I didn't belong. So I stopped trying. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped making myself smaller so other people could be comfortable. And for the first time, I felt something lift. Not all of it, not the whole weight, was enough. Because I realized that the problem was never me, it was them. And I wasn't going to carry it for them anymore. I thought that once I stopped apologizing, once I stopped making myself small, once I stopped trying to prove that I belonged, things would change. I thought that once I had the job, the success, the respect, it would be different. But I was wrong, because the world doesn't stop being racist just because you refuse to shrink. It started at work again, because that's where it always starts when you're black in corporate America. I had climbed the ladder, done everything right. I had stayed late, worked harder than everyone else, made sure my work was undeniable, and yet, one day I walked into a meeting with a new client, the kind of account that could change the direction of my career. I had spent weeks preparing. I knew the numbers inside and out. I was ready. I extended my hand to introduce myself, and he hesitated just for a second, just long enough for me to notice before he shook it and forced a smile. But his next words told me everything. "Oh, I didn't expect you to be..." He caught himself stopped before saying it, but I already knew what the next word was supposed to be. Like that moment in elementary school when my teacher wanted to shorten my name, like that moment at the park when the kids told me I didn't belong, like every time I walked into a space where people thought I wasn't supposed to be and they made sure I knew it. I smiled tightly, sat down and did my job better than anyone else in that room, but it didn't matter because after the meeting my manager pulled me aside, his voice low, careful. "The client had some concerns," he said. I frowned. Concerns about what? The strategy? The budget? He sighed like I was making him say something he didn't want to say. He just wasn't sure you were the right fit for this account. Right fit. That same phrase that had followed me for years. Culture fit, leadership fit, team fit. A polite way of saying not you. I exhaled slowly. What does that mean? He shifted uncomfortably. We think it's best if someone else takes the lead moving forward. Someone else meaning someone white, meaning someone they were comfortable with, meaning someone who wouldn't make the client hesitate before shaking their hand. I nodded, didn't argue, didn't push, because I already knew how this conversation would end, because I had been having this conversation my whole life. And then something inside me broke. That night I went home and thought about every time I had let it slide, every time I had smiled through it, every time I had been told to pick my battles, every time I had swallowed my pride and moved on. And I decided I wasn't going to do it anymore. The next morning I walked into HR and I filed a formal complaint. The fallout was immediate. People started treating me differently. Conversations stopped when I walked into the room. Emails that used to come directly to me suddenly left me out of the thread. Invitations to after-work gatherings disappeared. The air around me became colder, but I didn't care because for the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying their comfort on my back. A week later, I got called into another meeting, this time with senior leadership. My manager sitting stiffly across from me, the HR rep with her carefully neutral expression. "We want to make sure you feel valued here," she said, in that voice people use when they're pretending to care. "But we also want to ensure that our workplace remains a collaborative space." Collaborative meaning don't make trouble. Collaborative meaning don't make waves. Collaborative meaning we're not going to do anything about this, but we want you to stop talking about it. I leaned back in my chair and said, "So what are you going to do?" Silence. "We'll conduct a review," she said. "We'll address any necessary changes." I smiled, "Good." And I walked out of that room knowing nothing would change, but also knowing that I had changed. A month later, I left the company, but not before I sent a resignation letter that detailed every single thing I had experienced, not before I made sure my co-workers knew why I was leaving, not before I made it clear that I wasn't walking away because I couldn't handle the job, but because I refused to keep playing a game that was rigged from the start. And that's when something happened. 2 weeks after I left, I got a message from a young black employee still at the company. "I read your email," she wrote. "I thought it was just me. I thought I was imagining it." And that's when I knew that leaving wasn't the end of my fight, it was just the beginning. Malcolm Hayes had lived in Brookpine his entire life. A small town nestled in the deep south, where history clung to every brick, every street lamp, and every whispered conversation. It was the kind of place where people still called racism tradition, where old money families controlled the town like a kingdom, and where a black man was expected to know his place. But Malcolm had never been good at staying in his place. He had left for college, made something of himself, and now, at 37 years old, he had returned as the first black principal of Brookpine High School, a school that for decades had been run by men with the same last names as the ones carved into statues around town. His first day on the job, he had walked through the halls with a quiet determination, watching students, black and white, watch him in return, some curious, some confused, some already resentful. And the teachers? They were worse. He could feel their eyes following him, their silence just as sharp as the whispers he wasn't supposed to hear. Diversity higher. They only brought him in because of those damn liberals. He won't last a year. Malcolm had been called worse. He had survived worse. But what he hadn't expected was how deep the rot went, and just how dangerous it would be to try and fix it. His first month had been a war. Not outright, not obvious, but it was in the small things. Emails being lost, meetings being scheduled without him, teachers ignoring the new curriculum changes he had implemented. A tradition of black students getting suspended at twice the rate of white students for the same infractions. A curriculum that barely acknowledged slavery, that called the civil rights movement a period of unrest, and that glorified men who had fought to keep people who looked like him in chains. Malcolm had tried to take it in stride at first, but then the noose appeared, hung from a locker in the boys' locker room. The words, "Go back where you came from," scrawled beneath it. The local police had dismissed it as kids being kids. The school board called it an isolated incident. Malcolm knew better. Brookpine had never changed. They had just gotten better at hiding it. And now that a black man had the audacity to lead their school, they were reminding him who really ran things. The next morning, Malcolm walked into his office to find 3 parents waiting for him. White, wealthy, the kind of people who had streets named after their ancestors. They didn't even sit. One of them, a man in his late 50s, suit pressed so tight it looked like his veins were about to burst, spoke first. "You're creating unnecessary division, Mr. Hayes." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, unfazed. "I'm enforcing rules that should have been enforced a long time ago." The second parent, a woman with perfect blonde curls and a pearl necklace, scoffed. "This town has functioned just fine without you coming in and changing everything." Malcolm folded his hands together. "You mean, functioned just fine for you?" A flicker of something sharp crossed her face. "We're just saying," the third man said, voice even. "Maybe it's time you reconsider your position here." Malcolm tilted his head. "That sounds an awful lot like a threat." The first man smirked. "Just a suggestion." Malcolm stirred. "This school belongs to all of its students. I won't be intimidated and I won't back down. So if that's all, you can see yourselves out." Silence. Then the first man stepped forward, close enough that Malcolm could smell his expensive cologne. "You don't belong here, Mr. Hayes." He smiled. "Neither do you." That night his car was vandalized. Slashed, tears, spray paint across the side, you know, and beneath it, another noose. Malcolm sat on his porch that night, a bottle of whiskey beside him. He had fought his whole life for this moment, for a chance to change something. But was it worth it? Was it worth the threats? The hate? The fear that one day he might not make it home? But then he thought of them. The black students who saw themselves in him. The kids who had never had a principal who cared about them, who had never had someone to protect them. He thought about the next generation, and he knew. They wanted him gone, because he was changing things, because he was winning, and so he poured himself another drink, and decided he was never leaving. But if they wanted a fight, they were about to get one. The first time Malcolm Hayes found the envelope, he thought it was a mistake. It was slid beneath his office door, unmarked. No name, no return address, just a single piece of paper inside. And on it, 3 words, written in shaky, desperate handwriting. "Watch your back." Brookpine had gotten bolder. It had been 6 months since he took over as principal, and the war hadn't ended. If anything, it had escalated. His office had been broken into twice. His emails were being hacked. The school board was pushing for his resignation, spinning stories about him inciting tension and ruining traditions. And then, of course, there was the police. The same officers who had dismissed the noose in the locker room as a prank were now following him home, parking outside his house, watching, waiting. He had seen this game before. They wanted him scared. They wanted him gone. But Malcolm was still here, and that was the problem. The second envelope came a week later. Same handwriting, same message. What? But this time, there was a photo inside of his house, taken from his backyard. That night, Malcolm sat at his kitchen table, gripping the edge of the wood so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had expected resistance, expected anger, but this was something else. This wasn't just about the school anymore. This was about him. And he had 2 choices: run or fight. The next morning, Malcolm walked into school like nothing was wrong, like his heart wasn't pounding in his chest, like he hadn't spent the entire night staring at his front door, waiting for something to break the silence. He passed teachers who pretended not to see him. He nodded at students who whispered his name in hushed voices. And then he stepped into his office and stopped cold, because this time the envelope was sitting on his desk. Someone had been here, inside his office, waiting. Malcolm swallowed hard and opened it. Same paper, same handwriting, but this time the words had changed. We're running out of time. That night, Malcolm drove home slower than usual, checking his mirrors, watching the streets. The paranoia was getting to him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, someone was waiting. And then his headlights flickered for just a second, and in that second, he saw them, a figure standing just outside his house, watching, waiting. By the time he slammed on the brakes, they were gone. Brook Pine was sending a message, but Malcolm had one of his own. The next morning, Malcolm walked into school and called a meeting. Teachers, staff, the school board, and, most importantly, the police. He stood before them all, shoulders squared, voice calm, and then he laid everything out. The nooses, the slashed tires, the threats, the envelopes. He named every single person who had tried to run him out, every teacher who had ignored the racist attacks, every board member who had tried to sabotage him. And then he did something that shook the room to its core. He turned to the police chief, the same man who had brushed off every report Malcolm had made, and he pulled out the last envelope with the photo of his house. And he said loud and clear, "This is attempted intimidation, this is harassment, this is criminal, and if you don't do your damn job, I'll take it to the state, to the feds, to the media. I'm not playing anymore." The room was silent. The board members shifted uncomfortably. The police chief's face tightened. Malcolm, he just stood there and waited. That night, he drove home faster than usual, because he knew he had just declared war, and Brook Pine wasn't done with him yet. Malcolm Hayes knew what would come next. Brook Pine wasn't just going to back down. Not after he had called them out. Not after he had forced them into the light. They had been running this game for too long, and Malcolm had just changed the rules. The first sign came that night. The air was thick with summer heat, but his house was freezing. The thermostat read 60 degrees even though he had set it to 75. And then the power cut out. Not in the neighborhood, not on the block, just his house. Darkness swallowed everything. And then, in that silence, the knocking started. Boom, boom, boom. At the back door, Malcolm stood frozen. His heart hammered in his chest, but he forced his feet to move. Slow, careful, he reached for the baseball bat by the fridge and crept toward the back door, breath slow, measured. The knocking came again. Boom, boom, boom. Harder this time. He gripped the bat tighter. And then his phone vibrated. A text message from an unknown number. "You're not safe." Malcolm didn't call the police. He knew better. The police in Brook Pine didn't protect people like him. They protected each other. So instead, he called someone else. A journalist. Carmen Blake had been covering civil rights cases for over a decade. She had exposed corrupt police forces, shut down entire school boards. And when Malcolm called her, she listened. Really listened. Not just to his words, but to the fear behind them. And then she said, "I am coming to Brook Pine. The next morning, Malcolm walked into his office and found the door open. That was the second sign, because he had locked it. And inside, on his desk, a single sheet of paper. Same handwriting. Same message. You're running out of time. But this time, there was a new line underneath. Mr. Malcolm's blood ran cold. They knew about Carmen? By the time she arrived that afternoon, Malcolm had already set up a meeting. The plan was simple. They would go over everything. The threats, the history, and then they would take it to national media. Brookpine wanted this story buried, so Malcolm was going to make sure the whole world heard it. But then, Carmen never showed up. Malcolm called her phone. No answer. He checked the hotel she was supposed to stay at. She never checked in. And then, just as panic started to creep in, he got a text. Unknown number. Look outside. Malcolm's breath caught. He turned toward his office window. There, parked across the street, was Carmen's car. Empty. He ran. Didn't think. Didn't stop. Just ran. The car was unlocked. Her bag was still in the front seat. Her press badge. Her phone. Everything was there except for her. And on the windshield, a note. Same handwriting. We warned you. Malcolm's stomach twisted. His hands clenched into fists. He wasn't scared anymore. He was furious. Brookpine had crossed a line. And no, it was his turn. He didn't go home that night. Instead, he stayed at the school, waiting, watching, and sure enough, at exactly 2:17 a.m. a car pulled up outside. Headlights off. A dark sedan, government-issued plates. Not local police. Something else. Something worse. Two men stepped out, dressed in plain black clothing. No badges. No names. And Malcolm knew they weren't here to talk. He moved before they did. Slipped out the back, heart pounding. Ran toward the one place he knew they wouldn't expect him to go. The police station. Walking into Brookpine PD was like walking into enemy territory. Every head turned. Every pair of eyes locked onto him. And then the chief stepped out of his office. A slow, knowing smirk curling on his lips, like he had been expecting this. "Mr. Hayes," he said smoothly, "you look like you've seen a ghost." Malcolm clenched his jaw. Didn't give him the satisfaction of fear. "I want to report a missing person." The chief raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and who might that be?" Malcolm dropped the note onto his desk. The chief glanced at the paper. He didn't even pretend to be surprised. He just leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled together. And then he said, "Walk away, Malcolm, while you still can." A threat, a warning, and confirmation of everything. The silence stretched. Malcolm felt the weight of the room pressing down on him. The cold, sharp realization that he was alone in this. But then, the door burst open, and standing there, soaked, shaking, eyes wide with terror, was Carmen. Her clothes were dirty, her lip was bleeding, and her voice was hoarse when she pointed at the chief. It was him! The room erupted. Officers scrambled. Some stood frozen. Some moved. Too fast, too defensive. Malcolm? He grabbed Carmen's arm and ran. They didn't stop. Didn't look back. Just tore out of the building and into the night. Into whatever came next. Because Malcolm knew one thing for sure. Brooke Pine was done playing. And now, so was he. Michael had always believed that the world was changing. Growing up in Chicago, he had seen the marches, the protests, the speeches about unity and equality. He had listened to his grandfather's stories about segregation, about how he wasn't allowed to sit at certain counters or drink from certain fountains. His father had told him about redlining, about how their family had been forced to live in a neighborhood filled with crime and underfunded schools because banks refused to give black families loans. But Michael believed that things were different now. He had worked hard, graduated with honors, and landed a job at one of the most prestigious financial firms in New York City. He was the definition of success. He had beaten the odds. But the world had a way of reminding him that no matter how far he climbed, he would never truly escape the weight of his skin. It started subtly, almost in ways he could dismiss. His first week at the firm, he noticed the way the receptionist hesitated when he walked through the doors, as if she was waiting for him to prove he belonged there. When he sat in meetings, his colleagues would talk over him, take credit for his ideas, and offer him patronizing smiles when he tried to assert himself. But he told himself it was just office politics. Everyone had to prove themselves in a competitive firm. Then came the client dinner. Michael had worked for months on landing a high-profile client, a hedge fund manager with billions in assets. When the night of the dinner arrived, he showed up at the restaurant early, dressed in his best suit, feeling proud of what he had accomplished. But when he approached the host to check in, the man barely glanced at him before saying, "The kitchen entrance is in the back." Michael froze. "Excuse me?" The host looked at him properly for the first time, eyes flickering with realization, but he didn't apologize. I thought you were... Never mind." Michael forced a smile, pretending it didn't sting. "I have a reservation under Carter and Associates." The host led him to the table, and as he sat down, he saw his colleagues arrive. They laughed, shook hands, and patted each other on the back, oblivious to what had just happened. When Michael told them, one of them chuckled and said, "You know, you do kind of look like a waiter." Another one added, "Relax, man, no need to pull the race card." Michael didn't argue. He had learned long ago that there was no winning those conversations. He simply smiled, sipped his drink, and buried the anger deep inside. The real blow came months later. Michael had been working tirelessly on a pitch for a major international client. He had spent weeks crafting the perfect presentation, running numbers, anticipating every question. On the day of the meeting, he walked into the conference room feeling confident. But before he could even begin, his boss, David Sinclair, turned to one of the white associates and said, "Why don't you present this one?" Michael blinked. "Sir, I prepared the presentation." Sinclair barely looked at him. "I know, but I think Jason has a better understanding of what the client wants." Jason, who had barely contributed anything to the project, nodded eagerly and took over. Michael sat there, humiliated, watching someone else take credit for his work. And when the meeting ended, when the client signed the deal, it was Jason who got the praise. Michael sat at his desk that evening, staring at his reflection in the darkened window. It was the same feeling his father had described when he had been passed over for promotions time and time again. The same feeling his grandfather had described when he had been forced to step off the sidewalk to let white men pass. He had thought he could escape it, but no matter how hard he worked, the glass ceiling was still there. It had just been polished to be invisible. A few weeks later, Michael was walking home from work when he heard shouting down the street. A black teenager was standing in front of a clothing store, his hands raised as a police officer pointed a gun at him. "He didn't do anything," a woman screamed. Michael's body moved before his mind could catch up. He ran toward the scene, his suit jacket flapping behind him. "Officer, what's going on?" The cop turned to him. "Stay back." Michael ignored him, looking at the terrified teen. "What's your name?" "Darius," the boy stammered. I was just looking at the sneakers in the window. I didn't even go inside." Michael turned back to the cop. "Did he steal something?" "The store owner called about a suspicious person." Michael clenched his jaw. "A suspicious person because he's black?" The cop glared at him. "I said stay back." Michael pulled out his phone and started recording. The officer stiffened but lowered his gun slightly. "Sir, I need you to put that away." "No," Michael said. "You need to explain why you pulled a gun on an unarmed kid." The officer stared at him for a long moment, then turned to Darius. "Get out of here." Darius ran. The crowd that had gathered started cheering, but Michael didn't feel victorious. He felt tired. That night he sat in his apartment, replaying the scene in his head. The fear in the boy's eyes, the anger in the officer's face, the way the crowd had held their breath, waiting to see if another black life would be taken. Michael had spent his whole life believing that if he was smart enough, polished enough, successful enough, he could outrun racism. But that was a lie. He had fought so hard to prove he belonged, in rooms that were never meant for him. The next morning he walked into his office and handed in his resignation. His boss looked stunned. "Michael, let's not be rash." "I'm done," Michael said. "I'm done waiting for a seat at the table. I'm going to build my own." And that's exactly what he did. He launched his own firm, one dedicated to helping black entrepreneurs secure funding, navigate legal barriers, and create generational wealth. He hired young black professionals who had been overlooked, mentoring them, teaching them how to play the game while working to change the rules. Years later, he was featured in Forbes as one of the most influential business leaders in America. His old firm had tried to recruit him back, but he had laughed and declined. One afternoon, as he was leaving his office, he saw a familiar face. Darius, now a college student, standing in the lobby. "I just wanted to say thank you," Darius said, "for that night, for standing up for me." Michael smiled. "You don't have to thank me. Just promise me you'll stand up for someone else one day." Darius nodded. "I will." Michael watched him walk away, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. The world wasn't changing fast enough, but he was done waiting. He was going to change it himself. Michael had built something of his own. His firm, Carter & Co., had grown into one of the most successful black-owned financial firms in the country, providing funding and legal assistance to minority entrepreneurs. He had carved out a space for people like him, people who had been denied opportunities, underestimated, overlooked. His work had earned him recognition, wealth, and influence. But with success came new battles, ones he had never anticipated. It started with a single email. Subject: stay in your lane. Message: you think you're changing things? You're just another black man who got lucky. Don't forget your place. Michael deleted it. He had received hate mail before, especially after Forbes named him one of the most influential business leaders in America. Some people couldn't stand seeing a black man succeed. Then the call started. Blocked numbers, voicemails filled with slurs, vague threats about watching him. He tightened his security, installed cameras in his office and home, but he refused to let fear control him. He had worked too hard to let faceless cowards push him back into silence. One evening, after a long day of meetings, he stepped out of his office into the underground parking garage. He was unlocking his car when he heard footsteps approaching. He turned, already on edge, but relaxed when he recognized the man walking toward him. It was David Sinclair, his old boss from the firm he had left years ago. Michael frowned. "David, didn't expect to see you here." David smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You've done well for yourself." "I hope." David's expression darkened slightly. You could have stayed. We would have made room for you. Michael clenched his jaw. I didn't want a seat at your table. I built my own. Davy sighed. That's the problem, Michael. You've made yourself too visible, too loud. There are people who don't like that. Michael crossed his arms. Are you one of them? David chuckled. I don't care what you do, but the people I work with, they do. You're disrupting things. You're making powerful people uncomfortable. Michael stared at him. Is that a threat? David shook his head. It's advice. Step back. Tone it down. Stay out of politics. Michael took a step closer. You know what I learned, David? No matter how quiet I was, no matter how much I played by the rules, people like you still saw me as a threat, so why should I stop now? David's smile faded. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Then you should know what you're up against. He handed it to Michael and walked away. Michael unfolded the paper and felt his stomach tighten. It was a dossier. On him. His financial records, his personal information, even photos of his home. Someone had been watching him. He exhaled slowly. They wanted to intimidate him. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Underscore, 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 under, underscore, 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 discore, discore, underscore, 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 discord. Michael didn't go to the police. He had learned a long time ago that when you were black in America, the police were often the last people who would protect you. Instead, he went to someone he trusted, his old friend, Malik. Malik had turned his activism into a full-time job, working with organizations that fought against systemic racism in business and politics. If anyone knew how to handle a situation like this, it was him. They met in a quiet cafe, away from prying eyes. Malik glanced at the dossier and let out a low whistle. Damn, they're not playing around. I need to know who sent this, Michael said. Malik nodded. I've got some contacts. I'll look into it. In the meantime, Michael doubled his security. He made sure his employees were protected, reinforced his systems, and kept his inner circle close. If they thought they could scare him into silence, they had underestimated him. But the threats escalated. One night, he came home to find his front door ajar. His stomach dropped. He pulled out his phone and called his head of security. Someone's been in my house. The team arrived within minutes. They swept the place, checking every room. Nothing was stolen. But on his desk there was a single sheet of paper with 2 words written in bold letters. Michael's hands trembled slightly as he stared at the note. He wasn't afraid for himself, but he had employees, friends, people who relied on him. This wasn't just about him anymore. That night he barely slept. Underscore, 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 underscore. Underscore, 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 underscore. A week later, Malik called. I found something. They met at a private office Malik used for sensitive work. He pulled up a file on his laptop. The people behind this, it's not just some racist trolls. It's a coordinated effort. There's a network of corporate leaders, politicians, and law enforcement officials who are actively trying to suppress black economic power. And your name is on their radar. Michael wasn't surprised, because I refused to stay quiet. Exactly. You're not just successful, Michael. You're using your success to help others. That makes you dangerous to them. Michael leaned back, processing the information. So what do we do? Malik grinned. We expose them. Over the next few weeks, they gathered evidence, connected dots, and built a case. They found proof of companies redlining black entrepreneurs, banks denying loans based on race, and police departments working with corporate interests to silence activists. And then they released it. It started with an article, an expose detailing the network's operations. The story went viral, picked up by major news outlets. Protests erupted, investigations were launched. Some of the most powerful people in the country were suddenly on the defensive. Michael knew there would be retaliation, and he was right. A few nights after the story broke, he was driving home when he noticed a black SUV in his rearview mirror. It followed him for miles. When he turned onto a quieter street, the SUV sped up. Michael gripped the wheel. He wasn't about to be intimidated. He made a sharp turn onto a busy road, forcing the SUV to back off. When he got home, he sent a message to Malik. "They're coming for me." Malik's response was immediate. "Let them. We're not backing down." Underscore 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 and The attacks kept coming, but Michael refused to fall. He hired more lawyers, expanded his firm, and created an organization dedicated to funding black businesses nationwide. He used every tool at his disposal to fight back. And then something incredible happened. A wave of black-owned businesses started booming. The exposure had forced banks to change their policies, had pushed companies to be more transparent. Michael had been fighting a war, but now he was winning battles. One day he received an unexpected visitor. David Sinclair. Michael folded his arms. "Here to give me another warning?" David shook his head. "You won." Michael raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" "The people who came after you, they're losing power. Too much attention, they're backing off." Michael studied him. "And why are you telling me this?" David hesitated. "Because I was part of it." Michael clenched his jaw. David sighed. "I did what I was told, but I see now you're not just another success story. You're changing the game, and I was wrong to try and stop you." Michael exhaled slowly. "I don't need your apology. I need people like you to do better." David nodded. "I'm working on it." As he left, Michael stared out his window, watching the city move beneath him. He had started this journey just trying to succeed. Now he was leading a revolution. And he wasn't done yet. Elijah Carter had spent his whole life believing in justice. His mother had been a teacher, his father had been a civil rights lawyer who fought for the voiceless, and Elijah, he had chosen a different battlefield, the courtroom. By the time he was 35, he was one of the top public defenders in New Orleans. He had represented people who had been tossed aside by the system, people the court never truly saw as innocent until proven guilty. But there was one thing he had learnt. The law wasn't blind, it just turned a blind eye. And when the case of Jamal Rivers landed on his desk, Elijah realized he was about to face the fight of his life. Jamal was 19 years old. He had been arrested for armed robbery. The police claimed he had held up a liquor store waving a gun and demanding cash. The problem? Jamal hadn't been anywhere near the store. He had been at a friend's house playing video games. There was no DNA, no fingerprints, no weapon recovered. Just a grainy security video of a black teenager in a hoodie and a white police officer who had sworn under oath that Jamal was the suspect. Elijah had seen too many cases like this. A black boy, a white cop, a rushed conviction. The prosecution offered a plea deal, 10 years in prison. Jamal refused. "I didn't do it," he told Elijah. "I'm not taking time for something I didn't do." So Elijah prepared for trial. And then the threats started. First, his office was broken into. Nothing was stolen, except Jamal's case files. Then he started noticing the same unmarked car parked outside his house at night. And then a phone call. A voice, low, controlled. "Walk away, Carter, this isn't your fight." Elijah knew what that meant. Someone wanted Jamal convicted, and they were willing to play dirty to make it happen. He started digging. The cop who had arrested Jamal, Officer Greg Mathers, had a history. 2 of no misconduct complaints, 6 brutality accusations, and 2 prior wrongful convictions of black teenagers. But the police department had covered for him every time. Elijah took the evidence to the judge. Motion to dismiss the case. Denied. Jamal's trial would move forward. And Elijah realized something. This wasn't just about Jamal. This was about a system that was designed to destroy black boys like him. In court, the prosecution painted Jamal as a dangerous thug. They showed his social media pictures, twisting normal teenage posts into something sinister. They called him a threat to the community. They leaned into every stereotype, every fear. But Elijah, he fought back. He called witnesses who placed Jamal nowhere near the crime scene. He exposed Officer Mathers' dirty history to the jury. And then the final blow. Malik, an investigative journalist, uncovered surveillance footage from a different angle. It showed the real suspect. A young black man, yes, but not Jamal. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Then the verdict. Not guilty. Jamal fell into his mother's arms, sobbing. Elijah should have felt relief. Instead, he felt rage. Because he knew this was just one case. And for every Jamal who walked free, there were 100 more who didn't. So he made a decision. He wasn't just going to defend innocent men. He was going to take down the system that made them guilty in the first place. Elijah started reopening old cases, looking for patterns of corruption, and he found them. Hundreds of black men wrongfully convicted, all tied to the same network of cops, judges, and prosecutors. This wasn't random injustice. It was a machine. And Elijah was about to break it. He filed a lawsuit against the city, demanded investigations into wrongful convictions. The police department panicked. they leaked false stories about him, called him radical, said he was anti-police. Then the real warning came. A brick through his office window with a note, "Stop or else." Elijah knew what that meant. They were scared because for the first time someone was fighting back. The lawsuit went to trial. The city fought hard, but Elijah had the evidence. Years of fabricated police reports. Dozens of cops caught lying under oath. And then the final piece. A former prosecutor came forward, admitted that he had knowingly sent innocent black men to prison just to boost conviction rates. The courtroom exploded. The judge ruled in Elijah's favor. And the city? They were forced to reopen 250 cases. That night, Elijah stood outside the courthouse, watching as the first wrongfully convicted men walked free. One of them, a man who had spent 20 years behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, grabbed his hand. "Because of you, I get to see my daughter again." Elijah swallowed hard. This was why he fought. This was why he would never stop. Because the system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as it was designed to. And he was going to burn it to the ground. Brick by brick. Case by case. Until justice wasn't just a word. It was real. Elijah Carter had won a battle, but the war was far from over. The lawsuit had forced the city to reopen 250 wrongful convictions, and it had exposed the deep, rotten core of a system that thrived on the destruction of black lives. But the victory had come at a cost. His name was now everywhere. Some called him a hero. Others called him a problem. But Elijah didn't care about fame, and he sure as hell didn't care about what the police union or corrupt city officials thought of him. He cared about justice, and his next case was about to test everything he believed in. It started with a call from Danielle Rivers. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice shaking. "My brother's been arrested for murder." Elijah sighed. "Danielle, I don't take murder cases. You need a defense." "He didn't do it." Elijah rubbed his temples. "That's what everyone says." She went quiet for a second. Then, "They're framing him, just like they tried to do with Jamal." That stopped him. "Who's they?" Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. "The same cops you exposed in your lawsuit, the ones you put under investigation." Elijah's stomach tightened. "Where is he now?" She exhaled, relieved. "Cook County Jail." Elijah grabbed his coat. Michael Rivers was 22 years old. A college student, a volunteer at a local youth center, and now a murder suspect. The police claimed he had shot and killed a white man, Brian Lowell, in a robbery gone wrong. Elijah read the police report. It was full of holes. The murder weapon was never recovered. No physical evidence linked Michael to the crime, and the eyewitness, a known informant who had lied in multiple cases before. This wasn't just a weak case. It was a setup. Elijah had seen this before. A black man accused of killing a white man. The system didn't need proof. They just needed a conviction. And Elijah knew who was behind it. Detective Greg Mathers, the same cop who had tried to frame Jamal Rivers. The same cop who had been exposed during Eliza's lawsuit. He had lost his badge, but now he was back, whispering in the ears of his old colleagues, pulling strings behind the scenes. And he wanted revenge. Elijah clenched his jaw. This wasn't just about Michael. This was personal. They weren't just trying to destroy another black man's life. They were trying to destroy Elijah too. He met with Michael in jail. The young man's hands were shaking as he sat across from Elijah. "I didn't kill that man," he said. "I don't even own a gun." Elijah studied him. "Then why do they think you did?" Michael swallowed hard. "Because they needed someone, and they had picked him." The trial date was set. The prosecution offered a plea deal, 20 years in prison. Michael refused. "I'm not going to prison for something I didn't do." So Elijah prepared for war. First, he went after the eyewitness. He dug into his past cases, found 4 instances where he had lied under oath, found 2 cases where he had been paid by the police to testify. Elijah filed a motion to have the testimony thrown out. The judge, a conservative, police-friendly old man, denied it. Of course he did. So Elijah kept digging, and what he found changed everything. The security camera at the crime scene? The police claimed it wasn't working, but Elijah pulled city maintenance reports, and guess what? It had been working just fine until the night of the murder. Then the footage had disappeared. Elijah filed a subpoena, forced the city to release backup storage files, and what did he find? The real killer, a white man, same height and build as Michael, but clearly not him. Elijah took the footage to the judge. The prosecution tried to block it, called it irrelevant, but Elijah wouldn't back down. "If this footage is irrelevant," he said in court, "then so is this entire case." The judge had no choice. He allowed the footage, and in 1 second the case collapsed. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Not guilty. Michael broke down in tears. Danielle held him so tight it looked like she'd never let go. And Eliza? He looked over at the prosecution's table, where Detective Greg Mathers sat, watching, seething, because he had lost again. And this time, Elijah was coming for him. He wasn't done. He filed a civil rights lawsuit against the city, demanded a federal investigation into police corruption. Malik the journalist published the security footage of the real killer, and then a whistleblower came forward, a young cop, afraid but tired of the lies, and he spilled everything. Mathers had been running a secret network of dirty cops, planting evidence, paying informants to lie, and, worst of all, framing innocent black men for violent crimes. They had quotas. They needed arrests. And if they couldn't catch the real criminals, they made their own. The FBI got involved. Multiple officers were arrested, and Mathers indicted on federal charges for conspiracy, for fabricating evidence, for destroying lives. He was sentenced to 25 years. Elijah had finally taken him down. 1 year later, Elijah walked through his new office, the Carter Center for Criminal Justice, a law firm dedicated to fighting wrongful convictions, funded by the settlement money from his lawsuits against the city, a place where black men and women could come when the system tried to erase them, where they would find someone who believed them, who fought for them, who never backed down. Because Elijah had learned something. The law wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. But he was going to rewrite the rules, case by case, brick by brick, until justice wasn't just an idea. It was a reality.